thank you, the Architecture Foundation and CAS Culture, for the invitation. Let me just share my screen and start with the lecture. I hope you can see that. I'm practicing architect, so the lecture will be mostly on project I did with my practice. And you are right. So it will be 3 projects mostly, different in scales and different in duration, ambit, but hopefully there is a similar way of doing, and certainly they are 3 of them, all related with the context of Milano, my city, the city where I was born, raised, educated, and where I work and run my office. So the first part of the presentation first chapter is called Nimbleness. And you are also right that this week was supposed to be Milan Design Week. Obviously, it was cancelled due to the dramatic change of everything. And at this time, I would have probably been out drinking at a local cocktail bar. And most importantly, I would be hanging around this building, Triennale. It's a building that was built by Giovanni Muzio in 1933. And the building should have hosted an exhibition about the work of Vico Magistretti, an exhibition curated by Gabriele Neri and held in occasion of the centenary of the birth of Vico Magistretti. The exhibition has been, of course, postponed as well. And I'm not going to talk about the exhibition design at all. I'm not even sure I'm allowed to show anything about the project, but I would like to talk about a little bit about Vico Magistretti, to introduce you also to the context of Milan and the context of Milanese modernism. Vico was born in 1920. It's been in my mind for months since I worked on the exhibition, and one day, since he built a lot in Milano, he's known as a designer, but he was first of all an architect, and he built a lot in his career. He built several buildings in Milano, and one day last winter I took my camera early on a Sunday morning, and I went to shoot most of the buildings he built in Milan. His life is very interesting, I think, because Vico Magistretti had this sort of predestined lives. I really love these lives in which you take over the profession of your parents. Vico was the son of an architect, and he became an architect, but he became an architect in his own way. There is an interesting, funny story in which his father is correcting his drawings as he is study architecture, adding decorations, and he listened to his father, but then he goes regardless to the review with the undecorated version of his project. He was definitely a modernist. He owned a lot to Ernesto Nathan Rogers. But what I want to talk about in the first place is his way to interpret the profession. He had an extremely small practice. He made use of only one collaborator, a draftsman, very trustful, and he refused to perform a lot of tasks that usually architects are asked to perform. He wouldn't do any site supervision, or only, going a couple of times to the building site. He wouldn't do any detailed design, specification and bill of quantities, not his thing at all. He wouldn't do interior design, so he was very focused in defining very well the scope of his work, the scope of his profession. And that allowed him to be extremely focused, effective, productive, and also very free. There is a sentence from Vico Magistretti that struck me when he says that he feels free, much freer when he deals with architecture than when he does deal with furniture design, which is for me a contradiction, because architecture is full of constraints, negotiations, and but then I understood that it was precisely his defensive system that he created that allowed him to be extremely free within the scope of tasks that he would perform. His buildings are varicolored. He ventured in different scales, programs. He worked for different clients. But there is always, and of course, he built for 50 years in Milan. He started in the 50s, but there is always, for me, a sort of continuity in his simplicity, geometry, and in a certain way, nimbleness. Is like if his buildings are not trying to be outstanding with gimmicks. They don't need to be memorable. They were, to me, for me, they were born classic. They are deprived of all the unnecessary structures that is not necessary to the building, and they are in many ways, for me, essentially Milanese. The beauty of Milan is not so easy to grasp. It's quite anonymous, pragmatic, and only, you could say, beautiful in this nimbleness, in this absence of extravagance, or at least the modernist Milanese architecture. And I think these buildings by Vico are very truly Milanese. In a way, I could say Milan is his buildings. The second chapter of the presentation is homage to the form givers. Is a small project of another exhibition, and I keep on hurting myself going back to the Milano Design Week 2019 that actually took place. We did an exhibition here at the office. It was a self-generated project and self-funded. We presented a collection of furniture, 6 marble tables called 6 tableaux. But I have to tell you the background of this project. There is a little predecessor of this project, and there is especially a client for this project. I was doing some years ago the residence of an art dealer, a Milanese art dealer, that is also important in this presentation, as you will find out. And we were discussing a marble table, a marble dining table for his house. And suddenly, and when he rejected all the tables that I selected from the ones available on the market, because I didn't want to design a table, he just basically challenged me by saying, okay, you design one, and if I like it, I will build it. Okay, so we did eventually build a marble table. There's something wrong here, maybe, but to avoid the designing, one day I had this idea occurred to me. I was browsing through a book of beautiful drawings, hand drawings by Ellsworth Kelly, drawings of leaves and plants. And I realized I could just basically trace, rip off one of his leaves and turn it into a tabletop. And then I could be free of, let's say, designing something which is not maybe arbitrary, but I found justification because it was part of an existing form. So eventually the table was built after a couple of trips to Carrara to source the right slab. And years later, in a moment in which, for other reason that I will explain later, I was kind of obsessed by marbles and Italian marbles in particular. I thought that maybe we could, with the office, start a little collection using the same principle. So we selected among many artworks 6 works from 6 different contemporary artists. This is Louise Bourgeois, and we used the Italian marble to create 6 different tables. I like to explain what we did in this project using metaphors. The first one is the metaphor of historical novel. I think there are novelists which decide that reality can be much more, sometimes much more extraordinary than imagination, and they decide to write about story that actually existed. Emmanuel Carrère, to mention one. And of course, there is also this deletion of hip hop that taught all of us the process of sampling, stealing a fragment of a song and turning into something else. So even the names of our tables are a fragment of the title of the work they were taken from. So they are also homage to the authors of the artworks, you could say form givers of our tables. So we did eventually put up this exhibition. We found support from a marble company, and let's say, not to empty the entire office, first of all, the tables are miniatures, so there are 5 of them. They are 1:2 scale models because they couldn't fit in our office, but they still work very well as coffee tables. We literally moved all our stuff, all our bookshelves to create a pedestal to display the table. So we didn't have to empty our office. So we use our furniture as a structure for the exhibition, as you can see, hopefully, in this time lapse. I hope it works. Okay. I think I'm stuck. Okay. The show had eventually good, I thought it was a small show. It was well received. We were selected in an article on the New York Times among the 13 greatest things to see at the furniture fair. So that was quite exciting for us. And after that, we started a small production. 4 large tables were built later last year and went to China, to a big commercial mall for fashion and luxury. And now we are actually even starting to think to turn this into a sort of endless project. So the idea now is to build a database of artworks that we can literally exploit, trace, copy to feed our technically endless production. And I move to the last project. It's the project that James referred to. Is the transformation of part of a building by Piero Portaluppi. And there is also a project that identified the most what we actually do usually as architects here in Milano. Transforming existing buildings or parts of existing buildings is what we do. It's a back-breaking profession, and that's testified by the fact that in 1934, Portaluppi took 2 years to build 5-story buildings, and in 2016 it took 3 years for us to refurbish 2 floors of the same building. Okay, they were a little bit, maybe 1.5 years of building permission, but that tells a lot about how hard it is to transform existing building. So I will tell you a little bit about the building. Casa Corbellini Wasserman is called from the name of the 2 spouses, Guido Corbellini, an engineer, politician, and professor, very influential figure, and Paola Wasserman, his wife, was the head of a pharmaceutical industry. They wanted to build their residence in a suburban area of Milan, but they also wanted, that was typical from the bourgeois of that time, they wanted to make a real estate investment. So they asked Portaluppi to also build a house that could host apartments to rent. And this is visible it's understandable in the structure of the building in plan. The raised ground and the first floor featured the master apartments, the apartments from the family, where the 3rd, 4th, and the attic were apartments, smaller units to be put on the market to be rented. And this also is visible in the treatment of the facade. The lower part is clad in marble and features very large modern building. This was a reinforced concrete building, and the upper floors are the facade is treated in a much more plain. It's rendered. The windows are smaller and more regular. There are few notable elements as well in the building, like a corner loggia, a corner balcony, and most importantly, a quite extraordinary spiral marble staircase that was used to connect the first floor to the garden, to the private garden, and that has an intriguing story, because the same staircase was built in 1933 by Piero Portaluppi and BBPR. They were his former students, in occasion of a pavilion at the Triennale Milan, the home of the Saturday for the Spouses. This staircase was literally disassembled and reinstalled with the bronze banister in Casa Corbellini Wasserman. These photographs are from Antonio Paoletti. He was the official photographer of Portaluppi. We could put our hands on them through the Portaluppi Foundation. And we also found some historical drawings. This is a plan of the raised ground apartment that became the art gallery. And these are some images we found of the interior of the same apartment. This was the very large hallway. It was a system of rooms to put the different rooms in communication. The dining room with the plaster diamond-shaped ceiling, marble frames to the doors, fireplace, and all these features, and original furniture designed by Portaluppi himself, and the plan of the basement that occupies a smaller portion of it matches the upper level for most of its extension. And the only image we found of the basement is a sort of a tavern with the fireplace and windows leading to a patio and then to the garden. We started the project with a quite accurate survey. When we entered the first time, the building has been left abandoned for 15 years. The last owner moved out in 2001, and then the building fell into decay. That was a lucky coincidence because the building wasn't listed at that time. It became only listed in 2004. So especially the apartment on the raised ground was partly transformed. They had, for instance, this awful electrical equipment, had a patina of 15 years of oblivion, but of course showed all the original features, even though, and while the basement was completely transformed. It was impossible to find original materials and fixture, and it was largely occupied by installations serving the entire building with a lot of problems. For instance, this is a drainage that Portaluppi embedded into the wall, and this is a basement, and it's collecting all the drainage for the entire building. So we first starting from that information, measured and built a survey of geometric survey. This is an interesting drawing, I think, because it shows how Portaluppi organized a very deep plan. It's about 30 meters long. It's like a square. Light arrives from the street, the garden next to the staircase, and there is also a courtyard and a little patio. But what Portaluppi did, he organized. I hope you can see the hand of my mouse. He organized like a sequence of rooms, cutting diagonally the plan from east to southwest, dividing living room, dining, the studio, and the master bedrooms and master bathroom, with the area for the servant and for the kitchen, which is the part up here. So it was like a sequence of rooms, very large, quite labyrinthine, you could say, and monumental. And but he also gave this sequence of spaces again the feeling of a corridor by using these stripes of marble that you will see later. This is a plan of the basement. As we completed the geometric survey, we identify and classified all the materials that were still there in the apartment. We counted 16 different marbles. That was about the time when we started to think about our marble tables, as well as wood, metal, and other materials. And then we started a sort of room-by-room survey of the materials that were featured in the apartment, shooting some photographs of the existing situation. This is the entrance with the decorated walls with the tempera drawing, like a hunting drawing from the family. And we mapped all the materials on the plan, internal elevation and reflected ceiling. So for every room, we made the effort of identify all the materials and map them on the drawings. And these images are giving you also a little bit the feeling of the place as we found it. As I say, the large living rooms or living spaces deprived by the furniture were could perceive the quite gigantic dimension. The ceiling is more 4.2 meters tall, for instance, This is the dining room that you have seen in the historical photograph with the repainted ceiling and some damages due to the water leaks. And of course the bathrooms with the fitted furniture, with the fixed objects, they, apart from the patina of time, they were visible as they used to be back in 1930s, and they are particularly flamboyant for the presence of the marble cladding. This is a green marble that Portaluppi, who was also obsessed by marble, really loved. It's called the Verde Chaland. And the last chapter of our survey was to identify also the pathologies of all the materials. So we classified cracks, leaks, damages, also manipulation that were intervened by human action, like the presence of electrical lines and so on. I'm not going through all these pages again. And this was the book, basically, the document that we provided to the superintendent when we started to discuss the project. At that time, there was a coincidence that we exploit. Our client wanted to organize a show during a design week. Again, it's design week, but this time is 2017. A show by Belgian designer Muller van Severen. They proposed to organize the show together in our office, and we accepted it. But since we had to empty completely our office, we asked them to be allowed to relocate in the same dining room in Casa Wasserman to be able to perform an extremely accurate survey. So I moved to the project, but I have to turn on the lights. Okay, sorry. Spatially, in terms of spatial organization, on the upper level, we did almost nothing. So basically, the only thing we did, as you can see here, was to replace a staircase that had been built in the 80s with a new, more elegant staircase, and more comfortable. And by doing that, we reorganize part of the floor plan, especially the former kitchen, which are above the staircase, and part of the hallway to expand the exhibition area. The staircase is actually feature exactly the same dimensions, the diameter and the ratio from risers and goings of the marble staircase that is outside. So when you have a perfectly functioning staircase, why do you have to design a new one? Of course, we use different materials. This is a plan of after the transformation. What I just want to underline is that apart from some small rooms like the former bedrooms and the former house of the servants, which are now the offices of partners and directors, the rest of the floor plan is occupied by exhibition area. I will explain later what happened to the floor in the kitchen, which is a very quite important detail. And the plan of the basement, in which we were much more free on one hand to do a more traditional renovation, transforming more radically the existing basement, to fit, to organize the offices of the staff. There are 4 divisions in the gallery: sales, administration, logistics, and communication, as well as a kitchen and a canteen for the staff. this project soon we understood became two different projects in one. On one hand, we had the apartment where we couldn't touch almost anything. We could do only small transformations, but we still had to provide a sort of minimum heating and cooling and good lighting. And then we had the basement in which we were free on one hand to transform and to equip an office with good comfort, insulation, and all the prescriptions that a contemporary office requires. But we also had to use the office to have all the installation running to provide, to connect to the upper floor. And also we had a problem, I think the real problem was that the basement was supposed to become inhabited by 20 persons, by the staff of the gallery, with all their needs, with all their requirements. So we really wanted to study in detail what we were doing. We built a 1 to 20 maquette, exploiting the skills of a Japanese stagiaire at the time, to understand what we were doing in the basement in terms of light, space, and communication with the different rooms. So we had basically two different projects. The upper floor for visitors, they can be a little cold in the winter, a little warm in the summer, and it's okay. They stay only half an hour or 1 hour in the gallery. And in the basement, inhabitants that spend most of their time and need a fully comfortable and functional environment. That reflected a lot in the building side. So we were basically running two completely different building sites. On the upper floor, we had to protect everything, touch as least as possible. There were, girls doing restoration on the walls, a very delicate transformation. We also sometimes surprises. At a certain point, this floor appeared in the former kitchen. It was a ceramic tile mosaic, and we had to change completely our attitude toward this part of the apartment. And the basement was a quite brutal and ruthless site. There was a quite big deal of demolitions. We spent really a lot of time trying to understand the intricate apparatus of existing pipes, ducts, installations serving the entire building to get rid of what was unnecessary, and to understand what we could touch or what we couldn't touch, like these electrical cables. And also we had the challenge to fit our own apparatus of infrastructure, which was very massive for two reasons, because we had to serve the basement, the office, but also the upper level. So we tried to control very well. We drew basically bookshelves on the walls to place all the cables, installation, fan coils, in order to have full control of these elements in our renovated space. So eventually, a year ago, or a bit more than a year ago, Massimo De Carlo Gallery installed itself in Casa Wasserman. We did then also 1 to 20 maquette because they needed a maquette to organize their first show. The first show was a really outstanding exhibition, I think, in which contemporary artworks and modern artworks were put into a dialogue. But I will show you, I will just bring you now, and I will conclude my lecture to a quick journey through the renovated space. And I would like, rather than talking about the space itself, to express or to point out three elements which are very relevant in this project. The first one deals with the insight of our client to move a contemporary art gallery into a modernist apartment from a celebrated, renowned Milanese architect. If as the client, our client believe art, contemporary art is now mature, is now ready to be exhibited in historical places and not in not only in neutral, flexible, anonymous spaces for which history is not really relevant. So if this is true, if art is ready to be displayed in these spaces charged of history and of architectural quality, this could represent a challenge for designers, architects in the future, and especially could be a paradigmatic example of the profession, the interior architecture, which I like to call transformation of existing buildings. The second consideration has to deal with the practice of interior architecture. I think the best explanation of what we do is transformation of existing buildings. And I think that every building or part of a building that you are called to transform has a story, and this story has to be understood. And by collecting as much information as possible, it's possible to inform the project and to act in a sensible and delicate way. So if this is true, again, this project since had to do with a historical building by a renowned architect, needs an even deeper understanding of the existing situation. And I think in that respect, this image and this room is for me very relevant, because the fragments of the history, which were not of the more noble part of the apartment, was just a former kitchen, but the mosaic, the tiles, and the original paint of the windows acquire a meaning, acquire sense, and are therefore probably even more important than the feature of the original spaces. I actually confess that I understood this while I was doing it, or maybe even after I was doing it. A friend of mine say beauty is often manifold, so it's not intentional. So this is a bit what I feel when I look at these images. The third and last aspect that I want to underline is related to the practice of conservative restoration, and with the difficulty of equipping a building which is 70, 80, 90 years old, like in this case, with all the infrastructure that today is required to offices or houses or dwellings. A building of 19 years old is particularly fragile. For us, there was a coincidence that the basement could really work as a machine to feed, and to make also the upper level work. But sometimes I wonder if the right way of operating on historical existing buildings shouldn't be quite the opposite. First, you look at the building, then you try to understand what a building could become, what this building could possibly be. without being transformed, without being destroyed, and then start your operation. Often, or very often, as architects, we found ourselves with already cooked dish. We have a client that owns a property, he wants to do something, and we have to find a way to regenerate without rewriting, and that is not always a very successful practice. So these three aspects, I think, are very relevant in the practice of interior architecture. And that's why I wanted to put more emphasis on this last project. And I think this is all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. So I do have some questions, and if you would like to ask Lorenzo a question, please just dive into the chat, and I will unmute you. But the first one is from Mark Pimlott. So I don't know if Rosie, you can help me find. Oh, there he is. There, Mark.
Yeah, he's unmuted now.
Yeah.
Hello, Mark.
Lorenzo, grazie. Thank you for your beautiful lecture. It's lovely to see you. I had a question which has been transformed by the unfolding of your talk. It concerned originally your the question of the use of sampling as a strategy in your work, which has placed you at a kind of distance to things which had been done. And I had wondered, of course, whether this was an attitude to Milan and its architectural tradition. But more and more, as you talked, the question of your responsibility in relation to existing buildings, and perhaps your responsibility to culture and a tradition, an urban tradition and an architectural tradition, was something which was paramount. And I wondered really what your position in relation to the notion of responsibility is quite well articulated, but I wondered how that influenced your other projects, because you're a very, very modest man. You have other beautiful work that you make. And I was wondering what its effect was on this other work.
I think well, it's actually great. It's actually impossible to join the discussion in this 100-day studio without referring to other discussions that I, for instance, listened to in previous lecture. For instance, Irene, I'm sorry, is always involved in this. Talked about let's say the setting architecture. I use my wrong English as a lower art compared to art, painting, and maybe this is a bit the answer. I think and also this relies a lot to Vico Magistretti. I really think the profession as something very simple and pragmatic and in a way unambitious. I really like to think that as an architect, I do provide a service or an intellectual service, yes, but I do accompany my clients in their very difficult journey to make their own house or make their own office, make their own ambitious or not ambitious, no? In that sense, I think you can be extremely creative without inventing anything. That brings back to the idea of sampling. And again, to another question maybe that was dealing with, for instance, with the decoration. One of the questions during Irene lecture was about the decoration. If marble, the use of marble can be a decoration. In a way, Portaluppi did that. His use of the material was completely the consequence of his obsession with the marble. He would literally select not only the kind of marble, but the slab, and compose with the marble. So I think there are many ways in which you can design without designing, and with sampling. And also the world, in terms of images, in terms of stories, is a repertoire already saturated with forms. That's why do I have to sit down and create a form for a table? I take an existing one. That's, yeah, it's a modest maybe approach, but I don't find this as a less creative approach. I don't know if I answer your question, but
largely, I don't want to. There are lots of other questions, I'm sure. No, of course, I'm wondering how you actively join this tradition, which is there. I see your responsibility in restoring it and being very kind to it and tending to it. But of course, you're a cultural actor as well. And
I think it's probably quite natural as a Milanese to join a certain tradition, because for a long time, at least, that tradition was substituted by a tradition of no quality. So, and I think, for instance, what I like to do all the time is to look at details of craftsmanship that you can find in a city like Milan. Every gate, every door, every window in existing buildings feature this extreme quality. So it's a kind of a natural attitude to become related to that period. It's like, I mean, I'm not saying I'm one of these Milanese running an old Vespa, you know, but it's a bit a natural attitude we have somehow to look at a past which is a little bit distant.
I have another question here from Philip Christou, and I think we're going to...
So you're unmuted now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. Hi, thank you very much. That was lovely to see. I didn't know that's the project that you're doing with in the in that building. And I was also struck by your comment when you're talking about the tables of reality can be much more extraordinary, did you say, than imagination? So also when working with the existing buildings, especially very extraordinary ones like this one, you know, there's not much that one needs to add or invent. I can understand exactly your point. My question goes a bit further and to ask, during the process, I know it's a private gallery, so they want to show artworks, and but they're doing it in an old villa, or, you know, a domestic interior, yeah? And I was wondering whether there was any discussion about some of that domesticity quality remaining in the gallery, for example, in the furniture that would be in the gallery, or anything else, yeah?
Yeah. It is completely like this. So to say it simply, an contemporary gallery is a commercial business, and the fact of looking at artworks in a space or in an environment that could resemble potentially your house, or what you would dream your house would be, it becomes almost a strategy, you know, a commercial strategy on one hand. On the other hand, that creates a challenge for the artists, the curators, or certain artists, that can decide to confront with the space. But yeah, I mean, of course, we couldn't go. For instance, we discovered the walls were featured colors. The walls were not white. They had this kind of military, earthy colors originally. It was a negotiation. I mean, I would have actually probably gone to restore the original paint just for the pleasure of seeing the house, how he was supposed to be, because also we have only black and white historical photographs. But that, of course, was probably too outrageous to deprive the artworks of a white background. So there was a sort of negotiation in the level of domesticity that we were allowed to, somehow provide. And of course, the furniture, most of the furnitures were gone, but the idea is also to find modern furniture, maybe in the next years, and add pieces that are also. There was an open day before the first show, but a lot of people from Milan came to visit. And one of the striking things is that no one believed that a certain wooden floor was original, because it was too modern to be original for them. And I realized, because it was it was not supposed to be seen as an empty floor. It was a floor that was supposed to be covered with carpets, furniture, so it was just a background. But suddenly this floor became the floor, and incredibly mysterious, because it was quite puzzling, to have this floor which was not decorated, not charged with quality as apparently as the other features. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have one more question from Irene Scalbert. Irene.
Lorenzo, it's lovely to see you.
The same.
When one actually looks at the building by Portaluppi in particular, and there is a feeling which one occasionally, or perhaps often has, when one goes to Milan, this kind of extraordinary sense of bourgeois opulence. But it's not only opulence, it is something which is deeply rooted. It's there is something which is socially highly specific, and which, okay, in this case, is from the 1930s. And I was wondering what it feels when one is working in a space of this kind, of which it seems to me there are quite a few in Milan today, and whether there is a continuity between the bourgeoisie with which Portaluppi was working and the bourgeoisie of the present time, perhaps your client, or perhaps maybe the question is more general than that. It's a question of Milanese culture, which is to us, so, I mean, to us meaning Londoners, so extraordinarily exotic and in some ways exciting. Yeah.
Mm. Well, Portaluppi, at the time when he built Casa Wasserman, as well as Villanecchi, that was only 2 years before, he was really the architect that was literally raking all the commission for the bourgeois, for the bourgeois in Milan. So it was really, until a certain time, he was the architect of that time. And this is important, but it's also important that I think he had, I think he was playing a lot with this. His sequence of hallways, like a corridor, I think is really like a trick or a gimmick. It's almost like this attitude to work for a certain client, but also to make fun of them somehow, no? So to really work with space as a kid, you know, in a way, no, in a very playful way. I don't know. There is, of course, today a bourgeois class in Milano, so there is a continuity in that. I was quite impressed because the amount of people that came to the open day of Casa Wasserman, and you really have the feeling these people is looking at this apartment as a, like you know, entering in this magazine that they come with a major newspaper with beautiful photographs of interiors from around the world. So there is for sure a continuity in that. Of course, the circumstances are very different, and I think it's also very different what the bourgeois clients ask from the architect. Because when you would hire Portaluppi in 1933, he would do, I don't know, he would do the toilet his way. You know, I do toilet this way. There's no discussion. I mean, once I get the commission and we agree that it's going to be 5 stories and this and that, for the rest, the client is not even allowed on site. No, it's my domain. With the bourgeois clients today, the role of the architect is much more pushed into a corner, is much less, the credibility of the architect is not the same. So, and as a consequence, maybe also the culture of the client is not the same. So I'm very privileged that I happen to work with this client in this situation, because he started such an ambitious project that is really heroic, I think. But I would say that, you know, to answer your question, there are maybe still fragments of that bourgeois class, but not a solid terrain on which an architect can also hopefully build his career, no?
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we should open it up to some applause now. Can we do that? Lorenzo. It is a very short hour.